This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. Today, we're talking about China, and so it's a great time to mention the 2021 Animal Politics book, Animal Welfare in China, Culture, Politics and Crisis, which is by Peter J. Lee. Among other things, the book covers contemporary policy in China, the Chinese animal rights movement, and the history of animal welfare in China. I also know, because it's nice to mark a milestone, that this is the 250th episode of Knowing Animals. The podcast has now been running for well over a decade, featuring hundreds of scholars working in animal studies. The first episode was released back in 2015 by Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I first took the reins in 2020 with episode 152. Initially, I was a guest host, where I became more permanent later. I hope there'll be many more episodes to come. Now, I first met today's guest at the biennial European Society for Agricultural and Food Ethics Conference in the Netherlands back in 2024. We sat next to each other for a bus journey, and I realised very quickly just what an interesting guest she would be for Knowing Animals. And that's partly because she was researching a topic that I'm sure will be completely new to lots of listeners, just as it was new to me. So let me introduce today's guest. Jin Qian is a PhD candidate at Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands. She researches China's environmental governance and its global implications, with a focus on the intersections of food, animals, and the environment. Her multidisciplinary PhD project focuses on wildlife in Chinese food systems. She's also involved in the animal movement in China, including hosting a podcast called Slightly Tofu, which might be the only podcast about animal rights in mainland China. And it also includes an English language series called Tofu International. Today, we're going to focus on her Open Access 2026 paper, More Than Human Practices in Wild Animal Farming, The Case of China's Forest Frogs, which was published in the Journal of Rural Studies and co-authored with Annah Zhu, Arjen Buijs, and Simon Bush. Welcome to the podcast, Jen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And also congratulations on the 250th episode. I'm really happy to be part of this milestone.
Could you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
Yeah, so it's actually a pretty long story. I first came across this topic maybe in 2020-ish when I saw a post on effective altruism forum. There is a very comprehensive list of all the vertebrates that are in captivity in the world on the global scale. And I was not expecting, but also not surprised to see China is the biggest producer and also the consumer of amphibians and reptiles. And it brought back a lot of memory because growing up, I have eaten these animals at home and seeing my dad killing these animals and also processing these animals. And even in city like Shanghai, where I grew up, these animals are pretty popular, at some point. But then gradually they started to disappear from people's dinner table and they start to disappear from restaurants and stuff. So I thought maybe it would be interesting to look at how certain food practices disappear because so much of our efforts in understanding animal consumption has been on certain practices being picked up, especially in Asia, right? Eating more animal products. So this definitely planted a seed in my head. And then after a few years, there's COVID outbreak. And then suddenly amphibians and reptile became the center of the debate because China enacted a very extensive ban on the consumption, trade, and production of wild animals. But this ban has lots of loopholes. And one of them that many people probably are not aware is that this ban only applies to terrestrial wild animals. And this has affected the amphibians and reptile industries a lot, the most actually, because they actually constitute over 90% of the revenue of this so-called wild animal farming industry, but just in terms of wild animals bred for food. And you can already tell that wild animal as a term is very problematic. People don't really consider fish as wild animal. But still, like just in terms of the official language that I'm adopting, like these are they are the lion's share of the wild animals that are being bred for food. So this ban has created lots of objections on the ground, farmers, trading associations, local officials, because even if they're a niche in terms of China's aquaculture, in terms of China's agricultural production, they're very important on the local level, on the provincial level. They're very important industries. And to respond to that, China's Ministry of Agriculture issued an emergency notice just a few months after the ban, and they decided to reclassify economic amphibians and reptiles from terrestrial animals to aquatic wild animals, so to exempt them from the ban. So these animals are now being governed as fisheries, as part of fisheries. I find it very interesting just from a governance perspective, because this is what I specialize in, environmental governance, because these animals now, their jurisdiction is being transferred to the agricultural department, the fishery bureaus subordinate to agriculture departments, but their habitats are still governed by the forestry departments. So this has created this governance silo. So species is managed by one department, and then their habitats is managed by the other. And of course, some of your listeners probably know amphibians and reptiles are some of the most threatened vertebrates on Earth, especially I think amphibians. And they're also very underrepresented in conservation literature as well, because they're not being seen as, super charismatic. But in China, a lot of these animals that are farmed, they're being commodified, are also, endangered or threatened in the wild. But at the same time, they are being farmed on a very large scale. So I think it will be very interesting to look at how this industry is affected by the policy change, especially with this kind of top-down, very bifurcated, binary way of thinking about environmental governance, how that collide with the messy realities on the ground. And this is what my whole PhD project is about, is to look at the farming, trade, and production of amphibians and reptile practices in China after COVID-19.
One of the things that immediately struck me when I first heard you talking about this topic is that I didn't really have any sense of what the farming of frogs or rana culture actually looks like.
Yeah.
Because there's this interesting tension that you say, well, they're wild animals, but also they're farmed on a very large scale. But the farming of them seems to be quite different from the kind of farms that might be familiar to European audiences, for example.
Yeah. So as far as I know, bullfrogs are the most commodified frogs species in the world. And China obviously is also a big producer of bullfrogs. But when it comes to native species, the animals that I study, what we call China's Chinese forest frogs, they're actually a kind of Asiatic brown frog, Chinese brown frog. There are lots of taxonomic confusions in terms of what species there actually are. Sometimes they are considered as a species complex. And more specifically, the animal that I study is Rana dabowskii. That's their scientific name. And the technology for the full cycle production has never been financially and also technologically achievable, because these animals, they require living insects, living feed. So, imagine in the agriculture environment, animal production, the feed cost is very costly. It's very expensive. And when it comes to these animals, you have to provide animal protein a lot. So it is financially not very efficient. So what these farmers do is that they set up an enclosure in a mountainous region, set up this enclosure in a ravine. They build up hundreds of these artificial incubation ponds. And in springtime, they would gather the frog spawns from the wild. So they collect frog spawns from the wild and then transfer them back to these artificial ponds to incubate until they finish metamorphosis and start to migrate back into the mountain. So they only need to take care of the frogs, the tadpoles, for about 2 to 3 months. And then until autumn time, they wait until these frogs migrate back to the places where they reproduce. So this is also a kind of specific animal behavior of this frog that I study is that they always return back to the place where they reproduce. So farmers take advantage of that and recapture the frogs. So year after year, they do that. And this is kind of like ranching, it's kind of like salmon production in a sense. So yeah, the spawn are in the wild, but the frogs are being taken care of for a few months. And then farmers consider this as like a semi-wild approach of farming these animals.
And that raises interesting questions about property rights over these frogs, right?
Yeah.
Insofar as if they're wild animals, they are in Chinese law common property, but the farmers want to think of them as private property.
Yeah, exactly. So this whole issue becomes very salient when the top-down policy change imposed the fisheries legislation onto this whole, the practice of farming these frogs in the forests. Because the farmers, on one hand, they want to emphasize that these frogs were being bred in this very quote unquote pristine nature, in this very undisturbed natural environment, right? Because that would increase the value of their products. But then on the other hand, they do not agree with fisheries legislation, which entails that the frogs are the state's property. And what they are doing is officially classified as stock enhancement, meaning that, releasing juveniles into the wild to augment the wild populations. And they think that the spawns they helped collected are their own property. And because they think they're actually acting out of altruism, they think they're performing a kind of environmental stewardship of the frog spawns, because otherwise the spawns will be dried out. Most of them will be dried out in the wild. So they really think that by saving the frog spawns, and also there are also financial exchange too. So in order to, say, for example, increase their scale, or sometimes they want to have, larger yield of bigger frogs, they would also exchange the spawn. So there's labor, there's also financial costs that went into the spawn collection practices. And that's why they think the frogs are their own properties. But then this has been creating a misalignment with the fisheries law.
I want to ask more about these complex entanglements, but in order to do so, I want to take a step back and ask about your theory, because I thought the theoretical engagement in this paper was really fascinating. So you draw upon the material turn in social practice theory and something that will be familiar to lots of listeners of this podcast, the more than human scholarship that talks about animals as co-producers of social relations. Now, I sometimes worry about this more than human approach because the theorizations sometimes seem to downplay the violence that's often involved in these co-produced human-animal relationships. So I was really interested to see you say that you wanted to expand the more than human approach to recognize farmed animals, I'm quoting you here, not as co-practitioners, but as sentient beings that co-constitute farming practices as much as they may conflict with them. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so maybe I should first explain briefly what social practice theory is. Of course, it's a very extensive body of literature, and people conceptualize social practice very differently. But in general, the theorists all agree that society is made up of social practices, which are routinized, open ended doings and sayings dispersed in space and time. So they really take social practice as a unit of analysis instead of individuals' perceptions, attitudes, individuals' activities, or the structural factors such as, capitalism or, the political economic approach. So it's somewhere in between. It's about how individuals interact with structural factors and vice versa. And social practice has been very much focused on routinization and habituation. And one of the major, one of the main turn in the last few decades was the material turn. So really thinking about how materiality, material arrangements shape, prefigure social practices and how they are linked to other practices as well. And in my case, I think some of the languages in social practice theory, they do not distinguish material arrangements. They do not distinguish material elements because human bodies, animals, nature and infrastructure, equipments, etc. They're all kind of grouped under material arrangements. And I found that problematic, not only because of ethical reasons, but also just in terms of how we actually understand practices. Because practices usually, when we draw the boundary of practices, we kind of think of like a manual. Can we come up with a manual to describe a certain behavior? Say, for example, farming frogs, right? So we can call this like breeding practices because it has what the practice scholar Shasky would call the teleoaffective structure. So it has a goal, it has an ends, it's a shared project, and also with emotions. And also, when we are theorizing non-human animals in social practices as co-practitioners or co-laborers, we're assuming they are sharing the same goal that direct the direction of practices. And I just think that is just analytically not correct because clearly it doesn't really matter if we consider animals have social practices or not, but it's very clear to me they are not sharing the same practice. Perhaps our practices partially align at some space and time. So when I look at farming practice, I think we have to make that distinction. So this is basically my theoretical intervention is to think about animals as structurally different when it comes to other materialities that are involved in social practices. Not to consider them as passive resources, but at the same time, not to equate them with co-practitioners, co-performers of practices.
I think that's a really valuable intervention, but it also provides a really useful lens for thinking about the frog's role in the farming. So, how do the frogs, through their own practices, through their own goals, influence the practices of frog farming?
Yeah, so I think one very obvious influence is their whole life cycle. The fact they are biphasic pretty much determines how we can farm them. And as I mentioned previously, they have been quote unquote resisting full domestication because of their species specific needs. This has been not only constituting as part of the practices, but also prefigure the way we arrange the materialities. Humans build up ponds in the forests, and they have to be attuned to the environment because these frogs have very specific needs, ecological needs. They require very thick canopy layer, they require mixed broadleaf forests and also perennial stream. So this is the reason why they are being so valued at the same time, right? Because they come with this association of quote unquote pristine nature. And just in terms of the life cycle, they take about 3 years to reach sexual maturity. And that, if we look at how animal agriculture has been developing, this is completely uneconomical. I think there are just in terms of the biophysical aspects, there are determining so much about how farming practices could be carried out. And also, in addition to that, I later zoom out onto the landscape and look at how the multi-species relationship also shaping all these practices, what we call, practice bundle or practice complex, right? Because there are other agricultural practices involving animals. They are sharing the same landscapes, they're sharing the same materiality. And these animals, their ecological niche plays a role in which practices end up to be the more competitive one. They are competing for resources, not only just natural resources, but also governance, the human resources as well. At a very basic level, the animals' interaction with the environment, their embeddedness in the environment, shaped how we carry out and also constrain a lot in terms of the way we carry out practices. And also the governance. As I mentioned, these frogs are biphasic. They spend half of their life on the land, which means that when we impose a fisheries legislation in terms of how we understand the management of the frogs, the fisheries departments do not have the knowledge or they do not have the power to intervene the jurisdiction of the forestry departments. They also don't really know how, say, for example, all this like wide areas of practices, say, for example, pond maintenance, removing the waste and also modifying the artificial ponds when there are natural disasters. And also when farmers have to find a place, find a ideal location for the ponds, they have to be very mindful about the trees because these trees are protected. And all these things are, the fisheries departments have no power to intervene, and they cannot really, like what I mentioned in the paper, they feel like their hands cannot extend to this, in this area, in the forests. So they're very limited when it comes to what kind of support they can provide to the frog farmers. So in that sense, by the amphibious nature of these frogs also disrupts the way we understand how nature, how ecosystems is being governed as well.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the broader Chinese public relationship with this farming practice. Is it a controversial practice? You mentioned, of course, that lots of Chinese people will eat amphibians, and I know that they also have a role in traditional Chinese medicine, which is quite economically important. But for example, do the frogs have any protection under animal welfare law? Is there a kind of campaign about frog farming or against frog farming?
Yeah, well, this is again a very long story. I hope I can unpack it in a few minutes. So these frogs, they are most valued for this product called hashima. In Chinese, we call it 雪蛤. And a lot of consumers actually don't know what hashima is. It's derived from the female frogs. It's the fallopian tubes, the dried fallopian tubes of the female frogs. And because after they're being processed, when they're being cooked, prepared, they look like this transparent jelly in the dessert, and the people just don't know what it's made of. So just in terms of consumers, a lot of them are unaware about this practice, about this farming practice at all. There are environmental NGOs who are very concerned. In like 2018, there was a national crackdown on farming of these frogs because farmers were setting up enclosure in forests when they want to catch the frog when they were migrating back, right? So this was very controversial at that time. But then, of course, now with this industry being kind of protected and also, after the ban, there is still like local level kind of promotion for this industry to continue to grow. They're able to justify it because it's part of fisheries now. And previously, it was difficult to justify. And also, when it comes to the welfare, we don't really have welfare when it comes to these frogs. We don't really have welfare legislation for aquatic species at all, to be honest. And when it comes to these specific frogs that I studied, they were classified as protected species, but they were classified as protected terrestrial wild species. So after they are reclassified and as aquatic animals, they are just removed from that protection list. So this has also been a concern for a lot of environmental activists in China. And I have to mention, production of hashima is really, really cruel. The people who are the vendors and also the people who are involved in processing the frogs, they would use like a line. They would hang the frogs under the sun when they are still alive, and they would use the line to stab through their eyes and then hang them together to dry them under the sun. And they actually require the frogs struggle to make sure that the fallopian tubes would move downward. And it would make the whole processing much more easier and the fallopian tubes more clean because it's apparently, according to them, it's not like contaminated by blood or other things. So it actually requires a struggle of the frogs as part of the processing of hashima. Very cruel, but unfortunately, we don't have a law for animal cruelty in China. So yeah, it's just not managed at all.
I mean, that's grim listening, but I think it's important that we are aware of these things. And it does tie in important ways to what I was about to ask you about, which is, if you like, your more kind of activist work in China, because I know you're quite involved with the animal movement in China. And I wanted to ask as well, since you're on a podcast, about your own podcasting, Slightly Tofu. So what is it that the podcast does?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking this. I have to clarify, I don't really consider myself as an activist, maybe just involved in advocacy, but I just feel very unqualified as an activist because all I do is just typing on keyboards and talk to a microphone. I don't really involve in like rescuing animals or, even just like in terms of legislative change, I write letters, but very rarely I actually try to push for legislative change. Yeah, there are many more, scholars in China who are, spending so much effort on making law change, etc. Like Peter J. Lee, the author of the book that you mentioned, he's also playing a huge role in wild animal protection and also, yeah, companion species protection as well. So yeah, Slightly Tofu is just a platform where I try to provide some community support to people who care about animal rights. I became vegan about 7, 8 years ago. And then at that time, one of the most struggling part of my life was not having anyone in my life who was vegan. And I feel like I was going crazy because, thinking about animals, not in terms of property, not in terms of resources, it was just really rare. Not just in terms of like my social circles, but also in academia, also in environmental protection field. So I think having a podcast and then discuss animal ethics, animal rights, animal abolitionism, just can provide some kind of comfort to people who share the same value. And we also do a lot of social commentary as well. So sometimes there's an event in China, we would try to make people aware that all these problems, whether it's companion species, whether it's, farmed animals, all these issues are connected. It is a lot of these suffering and oppression are connected. And also in terms of ecofeminism, like female oppression as well. We try to link all these issues together, social justice issues together, and provide a different perspective on social events in China.
That's really great to hear. And I know that a lot of people in the West have been completely unaware of the fact that there is an animal rights and animal welfare movement in China. And China is just perceived as this awful place for animal welfare. And so it's great to hear that there is this community, this growing community that is providing a bit of hope there.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say there is an animal rights movement. Maybe there is an animal welfare movement, which is something that I'm quite concerned about. I would say we don't really have a history of animal activism in China. Of course, if you look at that book, Animal Welfare in China, that book has a very detailed documentation about in the ancient history, China has always been attentive to non-human suffering. We even have slaughter ban at some point. But of course it was for other reasons. It's mostly because, say, for example, the emperor wants the people to be more governable. And they think cultivating that character, caring about be more compassionate about animals would help to make the humans more easy to be governed. But still, in our philosophy, in Chinese philosophy, and also in terms of history, we do have ideas and knowledge about how to be compassionate to non-human beings. But unfortunately, because of development, right, because of modernity, I think, it's just people have forgotten and they started to think that animal protection is this Western thing. It's all Western ideology. And people are very cautious about talking about rights. So animal rights become a term that a lot of animal activists want to stay away from. They don't want to use the right language. And they would also resort to welfareism, like, cage-free eggs or providing slightly better farming conditions, etc. And I find it very worrisome because we don't have abolitionism, we don't really have radical animal rights activists in China. But then the welfareism movement is drawing a line for our imagination as if this is the best we can do, is to kill them, quote unquote, humanely. So this is something I would like to clarify a little in terms of the animal advocacy landscape in China.
Now, Jim, we ask everyone who joins us on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yeah, the first piece of pro animal scholarship I read was probably The Animal Rights Debate, Abolition or Regulation by Gary Francione and Robert Garner. It is a very short book, if I remember correctly, but it was very formative for me because at that time, most of my understanding about animal liberation, animal rights, etc., comes from like a welfarism understanding. And I knew at that time I was intellectually more drawn to abolitionism. And that book definitely helped me a lot in terms of I just find the abolitionist position more convincing, especially after reading the book. But also, I do not want to completely close off to welfarist approaches to an abolition ends. Yeah, I would say this book clarified my position. It also gave me language for something that I was already moving toward.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, this is very hard for me because I think it depends on how you define scholarship. Because if we mean a piece of writing with citations and a serious argument, then I think my first pro animal scholarly work was probably about how to bring animals more centrally or more ontologically forward in environmental sociology in China. Because environmental sociology is also still at a nascent stage in China. So at that time, I was reading a lot about environmental humanities scholarship. And this field, like environmental sociology, emerged as a response to human exceptionalism. But what I find very confusing is that when they talk about the environment, the animals are not there. They talk about biomass, they talk about environmental flows, matters, rivers, landscapes, but they don't talk about animals. So over 10 years ago, there were already lots of scholars in environmental sociology wants to have this discussion, want to open up this discussion about, where are the animals. And I just think maybe it would be interesting to do this exercise in China's context as well. So I was writing this short essay about how to think about environmental sociology in China's context and taking animals seriously when we do environmental management or environmental governance analysis.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Yeah, this is also another very difficult question. I would name a scholar that most of your listener would know, which is Dinesh Wadewal. I remember reading his paper, Do Fish Resist, for the first time, and it really changed my perspective in terms of thinking about animal issues. Because previously, my understanding about animals is mostly informed by animal ethics, which is centered on sentience, right? We talk a lot about how to grant moral considerations. We talk about animal as suffering beings. Do they have interests, etc.? Of course, these questions are still very important, but reading Dinesh's work pushed me to ask different questions in terms of thinking about animals as resistant beings and also how knowledge about animals are being produced. Who produces these knowledge and what is that knowledge for? And also in terms of how his works have shaped my own approach, social practice approach in thinking about wild animal farming in China. I've already spent a lot of time thinking about material contestation. So this, when I read Animals in the Capital, the way it connects animals to questions of labor, value, capitalism, for me is very interesting, especially in China's context. So it gives me a way to think about how animals might be brought into conversations about exploitations and political economy and value, and thinking about how they are structurally unique as both laborer and also being transformed through the practices and being the outcomes, the products of practice. I think that is theoretically very interesting to me and also like an envelope that I'm trying to push with my own work as well.
It's really wonderful you mentioned Dinesh, because I mentioned the first episode of Knowing Animals earlier and he was actually the guest on it. So it's a
Huh.
wonderful full circle moment there. What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I think, well, of course, it depends on individual strength. But for me, one important thing academics can do, I think, is to disrupt conversations and just asking again and again, what are the animals? Where are the animals in this analysis? And I think if we think about doing academia, doing scholarly work as a practice in and of itself, the repetition really matters. The repetition can help normalizing something, whether it's being more attentive to non-human animals or being less ethically passive when it comes to thinking about animals as individual sentient beings. So yeah, if enough academics, enough people keep asking, what would my field look like if animals' lives were taken seriously? I think eventually that question would leave a mark and perhaps influence your colleague, your students, research communities, and institutions as well. And also, just speaking from a very personal note, even in a very liberal, very free country like in the Netherlands, I still feel very intellectually isolated as someone who does this kind of work. And just to have a colleague who would say, I'm vegan, I care about animals, I just think that is such a great thing, just emotionally would help me to feel less alone. And I would like to do that to other people as well and to make them feel less alone in this.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human non human animal relationship, what would it be?
This actually connects to the title of this podcast, I think, Knowing Animals, because I think humans often assume that knowing is always good. Of course, I'm not trying to attack this podcast, but I just feel like humans always want to know more, try to explain more, and decode more. And we really want to understand causality. And we want to make other beings more legible to us. And of course, knowledge can be very important. It can help us to help animals, protect animals, and do less harm, understand their needs. But I also think knowing animals can also be intrusive and extractive. And especially, I think, when it comes to so many animals that we study, we know them through control, monitoring, and confinement, capturing, tracking and take them away from their own communities and also not to take their knowledge seriously, right? So, yeah, knowledge is not neutral. And now we have lots of technologies like AI try to decode animal language. And I just find that can be very problematic. I think, do we really have the right to know what animals are communicating? Maybe not all communications is meant for us. So, yeah, I think if I can change one thing, I would say to change our assumption that animals should always be knowable to us.
What are you working on next?
Yeah, so right now I am mostly just working on my dissertation because I'm graduating very soon, finishing my papers. And yeah, my dissertation, if I don't mind me just repeat it again, is about amphibians and reptile farming, trade and consumption. So aside from the frog, there are also soft-shell turtles, giant salamanders. And for people who are interested to have an overview about this industry, they can find my paper on One Earth. There's a paper that provides more detailed analysis about the policy change and also the animals that are affected by the policy change. I'm currently working on just papers about soft-shell turtles, giant salamanders, and also my podcast, Slightly Tofu. My co-host recently stepped up, so it's just me doing this podcast now. And I would love to have more people, especially from the global south, especially from Asia, to come to my podcast. And we can really, create a networks of, animal advocates. I would love to have more guests from the global south to have more diverse opinions on how to push animal liberation forward and have people with different backgrounds and expertise. And I'm also building a public-facing resource directory. It's called Let Us Know. I'm sorry, it's another stupid name. It's part of my Tofu universe. So, like you said, people often, this is actually true. Yeah, like Chinese animal advocates are pretty isolated, partly because of language barriers and also partly because a lot of the social medias like Facebook, Twitter, like even threads, they are not available to us. We need to have VPN to have access to them. So I'm building. So this website is essentially to help Chinese speaking animal advocates and people interested in animal ethics, animal rights to find resources, books, articles, podcasts, videos, and also documentaries, films, and also vegan resources as well. How to it's about vegan consumerism. I'm sorry, but we still need to provide something about this. But it's also available in English. So hopefully in the future, this website can grow a bit larger and to become this one place where people can find animal rights resources. So I'm not generating content, but more like gathering all these information. You can see this as my personal collection available online.
We've started to answer this question, but let's just make sure we've got it down. It's where people can find out more about your work. And of course, that includes, so we've got the podcast.
People can find my academic work on Google Scholar. I actually don't have an active presence on social media, but they can just search my name, JinQian, or just Jin Qian Frog or something. And they can follow me. They can follow my podcast on, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all these mainstream podcast platforms. We do have English episodes as well. But I think, with now like technology, how fast technology has been developing, we can understand Mandarin easily. Maybe there are some, caption text to speech function in the future where people can understand our podcast in Mandarin as well. They can always contact me via my email, jin.qian@ver.nl. Yeah, hit me up if you're interested in animal advocacy, animal rights topics in China, and also if you care about amphibians and reptiles. I'm very grateful for anyone who wants to pay attention to these animals in China.
Well, thanks so much, Jin, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you so much, Josh. I hope I answered these questions clearly.
And thanks so much to you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on X or Facebook, and you can follow me on X or on Instagram or on Blue Sky and everywhere else. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.